Hello and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. My name is Gail, and my guest today is Bill Kuwik. He didn't waste any time getting back here. He was just on the episode before the last one. I gave him a choice. I thought he might want to schedule himself for later in the spring, but when he found out that there was an opening this month, he decided he'd better take that one instead of waiting till he gets super busy later in the spring.
Yeah, gets busy on the farm.
Yeah, so thank you for coming on again. And I have to warn you that one of the guests I had on last week is a hard act to follow.
Okay.
Her name is Heaven, and she's a pit bull.
Oh, you know, a friend of mine.
Northern Chautauqua Canine Rescue.
A friend of mine just told me about her yesterday. He volunteers at the kennel and was asking if a friend of mine was still interested in Heaven.
Oh, somebody, a friend of yours is interested?
No. Well, my friend Rob volunteers at NCCR, and he asked if a friend of mine might be interested in her, and so I mentioned to her that she was available, but I can't remember. I don't think I've seen pictures of her, but I know he told me like they recently did her genetic testing
and found out that
87.5% pit bull and something like 12.5% mixed sporting dog, I think is what he said.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, she looks like a pit bull anyways.
Yeah. I have two myself, so and I've actually, one of them came from there. The other one was from private owners. So.
Oh, okay.
Not going to compete with Heaven.
Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun. And there's this girl named Emerald, a teenage girl that helps with Doc Hamill's program. I think she does run one of the cameras or something. And she got herself signed right up to take a class, to be one of their classes, to be one of their volunteers.
Okay.
So you should have seen how excited she was filling out the form.
Right.
She just loves animals. She's just crazy about them.
Yeah.
But anyways, you didn't come on to talk about dogs.
But we could.
But anyways, we're back to the organic gardening topic again. And how was it that you wound up getting interested in being an organic farmer and doing things, growing food for markets and things?
Well, to start out with, I guess, really for me, I did become a vegetarian when I was in college, and then I got to thinking, it's like, well, I mean, all this stuff that I buy is conventionally grown, so there's chemicals used on everything that I'm eating, and so it just got me thinking about, growing organically, and I guess I always had kind of a knack with growing things. I did study botany and biology at JCC, and probably started growing some of my first plants there, but I actually do think it's genetic. My grandmother on my mother's side was a plant person. She would keep like glass, like gallon jugs that she would somehow cut the bottoms off them over some like perennial plants that she would keep out, and she had kept a screw cap on top, and then in the spring when they started to grow and it got warmer, she would unscrew the cap and leave a stone partially over it so it would vent but not get too hot. But yeah, I actually had my first just vegetable garden. There's a friend of mine in Kent, Ohio, and I decided that we would clean up this spot behind the garage and we were going to start a garden there. And we had heard that the guys that I lived with, who were in a reggae, rock, and blues band, had a member who had this beautiful soil out at this place that he was renting. And we were thinking, boy, we could use some of that for our garden. So we went out there, and they had an 8-acre peat bog. So if you pulled up any weeds, the soil was just like as black as peat moss that you'd get out of a bag. So we went over there and got a truckload, and the guy who had this property was just like going on and on about how great it was living there, and they had all this land. And I said, geez, you're not looking for any roommates, are you? As a matter of fact, we're looking for a couple people are moving out. So I ended up I started the garden with this guy, but then moved out there. And I have to say, I mean, I didn't really feel like I did that much to grow a really, great garden there. But I went over to a neighbor's and I cleaned out some old composted horse manure that he had out of a barn. I think just really literally like maybe 1 or 2 pickup truck loadfuls. And I spread some limestone on my 1/6 of the entire garden space that we had there, because there were six roommates in the house. And it was kind of interesting because that 1/6 of the garden that I grew on grew more than the other 5/6 all put together.
Oh,
And
really?
I remember one of the roommates asking me, he's like, would you mind if I went and grabbed a cucumber? And I was like, Ted, it's like I'm throwing away 2 grocery bagfuls of cucumbers every week. I just can't keep up with them. I'm like, take all you want. But it just, got me thinking. It's like, boy, it seems like I really can grow things. So over that next winter, I started, I actually read a book called Working Outside. I can't remember the woman's name, but she suggested that one possible profession for someone like me might be growing culinary herbs. So there was a seed company in Albany, Oregon, and it was Nichols Garden Nursery, and they had this free brochure. So I sent for the brochure, and I thought, well, herbs sound good, but how about growing vegetables and herbs for market? So
Right.
back in 1985, I started growing I had a handful of restaurants, like almost every week, between 12 and 20 restaurants I would supply, and I had 6 natural food stores within about a 20-mile radius of me that I was taking. I'll tell you, it's really kind of funny what happened the first. I didn't really, like they say, well, you should really have your stuff sold before you start to grow it. But it's like, well, you don't really know if you can really grow the quality that you can sell to a restaurant. Then, how do you set it up ahead of time that, hey, you're going to buy my stuff when I don't even have any experience growing it? So I grew this beautiful black-seeded Simpson lettuce, and this is really kind of funny. I went into this, there was a Natural Foods organic restaurant in Kent called the Red Radish. And I went in there one day, and the lettuce was just perfect, just beautiful. I harvested it, I washed it, I boxed it up. I think I had like 5 cases of lettuce in the back seat of my car. And I went into this place, and there was no one in the kitchen when I first got there. And this kind of hippie guy comes out, and I said, hey, listen, I said, I was just checking to see, would you guys want to buy any organic produce? And he's like, what do you got, man? Shrooms? I'm like, no. I said, I'm not speaking in any code. I said, I actually have some lettuce out in the car. Oh, okay. So he came out and looked at it, and I knew what the price of conventional was, and I knew what the price of organic was, and I was hoping to get the organic price, but I was trying to feel him out. So I went out and I opened up a box, and he was like, wow, that looks fantastic. How much you want for it? And I named my price, and he bought it all. And I was like, wow, that was actually fairly simple. But so that's how I really began, selling to restaurants. But like I said, like usually every Wednesday I would, call them, tell them what I had. They would place their orders, and then I would harvest everything fresh on Friday and deliver it to them. But then after 4 years of doing that, and mainly just from going to farms and visiting farms, mostly in the state of Maine, even though I was in Ohio, I would go visit these farms in Maine. I was a member of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and did fairly well with it in Ohio where I was. But then I thought that at one point I've really just read books and talked to some people. I've never really studied this really, or gone to a course or anything. So I thought it was about time, and I just happened to find that Elliot Coleman was offering a week-long workshop up at the Mountain School of Milton Academy in Versailles, Vermont.
Oh.
So I went up there and took his course, and great time of year to be into your new stuff. We started the class on January 1st and went through the 7th, and he was really encouraging me to come up to Vermont and work with some bigger growers. But I was like, well, I got my place back in Ohio. I feel like, he said, this course will help you. He said, but if you really want to get a real education in this, he said, come up here. He says, work with some big growers for a couple of years. And he said, you can go anywhere in the world and be a successful organic farmer after that. And I thought, well, I don't know. I still want to go back to my place in Ohio. But Well, long story short, 2 months later, I was living in Vermont, and I worked for one big grower. I was in charge of his tomato operation, 6 big greenhouses, 5,000 tomato plants I tended to like daily for that whole season. And then after that, because everybody wanted to steal his tomato growing secrets, somebody paid me more to go and work for their farm north of there, and didn't stay there very long. A few months there, but then I did work for a lady that did. She actually raised a lot of organic animals, mostly sheep, but she did veal calves and cows, but a lot of like smaller animals. But she also did vegetables, and she had all that manure for compost for her gardens, which grew amazingly. And but then I also then went. I worked for another. He was not organic, but he was really a good grower. He did rotate his crops. He cover crop. The only thing is, and I find this really kind of interesting, that he did the math and he figured out that it really didn't pay for him to be organic when it came to growing carrots and potatoes, because he liked to use herbicide with his. He didn't see how it was cost effective to grow carrots and potatoes with herbicide. So that's the only thing that he really did that was not within the organic guidelines, I guess. But which, I mean, and then from there I moved back here like 30 years ago, and then started doing organic market farming in the Dunkirk, Fredonia area, and selling to restaurants. I used to do 3 farmers markets a week. I had a small community-supported agriculture, and again, probably in the neighborhood of a dozen restaurants, some around Chautauqua Lake, some in Chautauqua Institution, the Hare and Hound, the Sword and Shield, some other places around here too. Brazil's in Westfield eventually, but which I guess brings me to, if I may, just talk about the general definition and principles of organic growing.
Okay.
We really don't use any chemical pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, anything like that. Everything is plant derived, and really, I always say, in a lot of cases, I see people doing things that to me are kind of like on the fringe of organic. I've seen these people getting the rock dust, and they're sprinkling it on their plants on the night of the full moon at midnight. I'm like, well, but I think the key is that there's organic matter in the soil, and you're kind of neglecting that whole part of it. So I really do believe in using a lot of compost. And like on the last show, we talked a lot about cover cropping, or that was the show before last. I think we talked about a lot about cover cropping when we talked about growing garlic. And right now, I know I showed pictures back in the fall, but I have winter rye coming up in all but I have 7 beds, and I'm just itching to get those prepped. And maybe this afternoon, actually, I will go through that. But I've put a lot of compost down in the fall. I'll rotivate up these beds, and it isn't. I mean, it's really. I mean, we're mid March right now, but with the way the weather has been, this would not be a bad time to plant peas or spinach. And I think it would be a good time to plant lettuce seeds indoors. We were just saying that if you wanted to go 8 weeks till Memorial Day with your tomato seedlings, good to start them. And actually, if you're going to go 8 weeks, they really should go into a 4-inch pot. But yeah, as far as organic goes, I really always think that you need the organic matter in the soil, which is where the nutrients come from to feed the plants. And really, too, it's like us. Like a healthier person has more natural resistance to disease than a person who isn't eating right. So it's kind of the same thing with vegetables. If you feed the vegetables what they need primarily through organic decomposition and all the bacteria and microbes and things that create the nutrients in the soil, then you don't have to worry about feeding with chemical fertilizers. And the same thing with pest protection. I know a friend of mine was on Facebook talking about some kind of bug pest problem that they have out in New Mexico, and I've never even heard of anything like that at all. Up here it was I can't even think of the name of the bug that they had out there, but I don't think we have it. But really, I mean, and again, I brought the row cover. The floating row cover is just this is actually spun bonded polypropylene mesh, and this is actually called AG19 Agribon AG19, and you can see it's somewhat see-through. I mean, it allows it blocks out 19% of the daylight, so it does shade it by a little bit, but this will give you 5 to 8 degrees of protection from like a frost overnight for number one. Yeah. So it's nice to extend the season now. But I've actually used this in the fall too. I'll plant. I used to plant 5,000 lettuce seedlings. I'd start the seeds on August 1st, and then the plants would go in around Labor Day, and then I would have these beautiful heads of lettuce by the end of October. But you know what kind of weather we can sometimes get in November, but they aren't really growing that much. But if you put even just a simple row cover over them, I know the first year, it was the second year that I farmed back here, which was in 1992. I had all my lettuce plants row covered, and on Veterans Day, November 11th, we got 18 inches of snow down there. And of course, I've had my naysayers over the years. So some guy was like, well, I guess your lettuce is all done now, huh? And I was like, well, I don't know. I wouldn't be so sure. It's like, oh, come on. There's 18 inches of snow out there. And it did get really cold. It did go down to the low teens, but this much snow makes for kind of a nice insulation.
Right.
When the snow melted off, I grabbed the edges of the covers and I flipped off. There was ice on them, and the lettuce heads were just a little bit compressed, but they were still fine. I know I was selling lettuce to restaurants up until December 21st of that year. It was cold out. My hands got cold washing them in that water. But but and again too, I know I've said this before, but I really do highly encourage everybody to get a soil test from the Cornell laboratories down in Portland. I mean, and honestly, I think if you know how to take the test, if you've ever done it before, to take your sample from your garden, you can actually take it there with you, pay for the test, give them the soil, and then they can mail it out right then. But if you've never taken the test before, they like you to take your samples from a number of different places, so you're not just digging one hole, because the soil right here could be a little different from the soil 20 feet away over that way. So typically what you do is you would like to, like if you're using a steel shovel, you don't want to take the sample from right where you dug with the steel shovel, because if the shovel's a little bit rusty, it actually could alter the iron content of your test. So what they say to do is dig a hole with your shovel, but take a plastic or a stainless steel tool, scrape away a little bit, and then take a little sample from where you've dug in and take like several different samples. You should dry it out a little bit, but they give you like a bag with like a twist tie kind of a thing on top of it, plastic bag that goes into a cloth bag, and then that gets mailed to Ithaca, to Cornell, and then they'll do your soil analysis. And then you get, I believe it's 2 sheets of paper mailed to you, and it tells you, all the nutrients that are in your soil, how much organic matter you have, like everything about your soil. And if there's deficiencies, they tell you how to correct it with either conventional or organic methods. I mean, they'll tell you to use either, compost or, cover crops, or, what you need as far as nutrients goes. And I myself have not done a soil test in a number of years at my place, but when I first started out, the first few years I did every year just until I got everything fairly down to where it should be. And then what I usually recommend is about every 3 years that you get your soil tested. So yeah, I guess to review, the basic definition of organic, as far as I'm concerned, is that you do have organic matter that you are actually using to add to your soil. So either compost or fall leaves, that adds organic matter to your soil. Cover cropping, as we've talked about before, and winter rye is a really good one, popular for this area in the Northeast. And I know I've said it before, but this is a great time of year if you had a plot that you're just going to leave from now until maybe 2 weeks before Memorial Day. is just get peas, just plant field peas, just broadcast peas, let those peas grow up to about knee high. They really incorporate really quickly, and they are a legume, so they increase the nitrogen in your soil, but also add a lot of organic matter to your soil that way too. Like I said, I have a lot of winter rye around. I know my one garden, I'm kind of thinking I'm just going to let it retire maybe for this year. I do have some perennial stuff in there, but I'm almost thinking just planting clover or alfalfa in there just for a long-term cover crop, which I may go back to grow in there eventually. But for right now, I'm just thinking I'm just going to tend to a few things and just let. There is one. I had 2 apricot and 2 peach trees in there, and I only have one peach tree left. Everything else has died off because I am actually, my natural soil where I live is very much clay. I mean, there's just a really tiny little bit of topsoil. I've got about a foot of the yellow-orange clay, and then I've had a pond dug, and they've dug down about 16 feet, and all there is below that is the gray clay and shale. So
really?
There isn't much. I think I can't remember what the name of the soil is, what they consider that, but it is described as poor to very poorly drained. So water doesn't go anywhere, which is kind of good when we have like the droughtier seasons like we sometimes are.
And we have had some of those too.
Yeah.
I remember the tail end of the 1980s. We had some really, really hot and really dry summers. I remember that.
Yeah, my last summer in Ohio was 88, and that was, yes, it was 88, and I don't think I'd ever lived any place where it had been that hot. But it was funny too, and that's what I always say. It just seems like our weather is just widely variable extremes. And that month of July of '88, where I lived in Ohio, was a great example of that. We had no rain from June 5th until the last weekend in July, so almost 2 months of no rain. But the first 2 weeks in July, it was so cold. And there, like here, I usually figure Memorial Day is like when we're past our last frost in the spring. There, it was 2 weeks earlier. So we had 2 weeks more growing season at the front end, and then there was 2 more weeks at the back end. So I had a month longer growing season there than we do here. But the first 2 weeks in July, I mean, we're talking about 2 months past the average frost date. They were warning about frost in the beginning of July. The first 2 weeks in July, our nighttime lows were going into the 40s. The last 2 weeks in July, the nighttime lows, the coldest it got for 2 weeks was 100 degrees. It would go down to 100 at night. And I remember the sun wasn't even at the horizon yet, and I'd be looking at my thermometer. I'm like, it's 100 or 101 first thing in the morning before the sun was even up. And I'd try to work, but I mean, I'd be out there till about 9:30 or 10 a.m. and I'm just like, I just can't do it anymore. And then try to put in a few more hours in the evening. But
that was a really hot summer. I remember the summer of '88. The stream dried up in the woods, and the temperatures were way up in the 90s all summer long.
Right. But it was, and it was super, super dry. It was super hot. I remember those 2 weeks, it was 108 to 114 degrees where I was trying to farm and just like trying to conserve water and not, overuse it or anything like that. But boy, you have like 2 months with no rain, and then we got this, I mean, and again, no rain for all those weeks. And then in one day, we ended up getting like 8 inches of rain. Everything was like flooded, and the gardens really grew after that big rain too. But I mean, the corn just got blown right over. I mean, it was just such a extreme storm like that. But so I don't know. I brought a couple other toys. Oh, I brought a stink bug in with me too. But yeah, I brought this. This is a soil blocker. I can't even tell you who makes these things anymore, and I wouldn't even know where to get them. But this it helps you to conserve on not use as much plastic like we do when you go to all the greenhouses and stuff like that. You can actually, you get your soil mixture, and you can use just straight compost with this thing, but you get your compost or your soil mixture nice and wet. You stab this into the wet soil I usually say about 3 times so it's really, really well packed in there. But you kind of use these handles you push down essentially to pack it, but essentially what you're doing is lifting up with your fingers to lift it away. And then you can fit, this is a 1-inch blocker, but there's actually a 2-inch, a 3-inch, and then I have a tabletop model that makes a 4-inch block. So you could actually start, I think it's the 1-inch block will go right into the 4-inch block. So let's say, like we were talking about tomatoes. So let's say we would start our tomato plants on March the 20th, and as soon as they're as big as that block, if they're maybe a little bit more than an inch tall, then we would put that into the 4-inch block for the remainder of the time. So you'd get a decent sized plant, and it would be nice and stocky that way. A good sized plant, because you don't want to use just those little. You wouldn't want to leave it in the little plug. For 8 weeks, but
No.
And that's the thing too. I have not done the math as far as like most times, and I know I read out of that Johnny's catalog last time I was here that one of the keys to starting your tomato plants is the first thing they say in the description of the culture of tomato plants is don't start too early. I have friends that have friends. They've got a wood-burning stove in the garage, and they've got a south-facing window, and they're starting their tomatoes in January, which is way too early. So it really, if you're just going to start them in the little cell packs, the little 4x4 cells, count back 5 weeks exactly from Memorial Day. And honestly, I think Memorial Day is a little bit early this year, because I think the next weekend after Memorial Day is going to be like the 30th, 31st, so you could almost give it one more week. And I know a lot of people think too that if they plant them early, they get them fruit early, and that isn't always the case. And I know with things like eggplant and peppers, it's the Stokes Seed Company used to be in Fredonia, and on their seed packets they would actually say in the Great Lakes region, like where we are, you really should almost wait until the middle of June to plant those things, because planting them early, a lot of times with a pepper, if the pepper plant gets too cool early on, you'll get a nice big pepper plant and no fruit. It'll trigger them to not produce fruit. So you're really not getting things in any earlier by you're not getting earlier fruit by planting them earlier. And I know great example, a friend of mine, we used to get the German Jim tomato plants from DeGolier Greenhouse, and she was a massage client of mine, and she came in, and I said, she was telling me she was going to go there and pick up plants. I said, well, pick me up like a dozen while you're down there. And I remember it was May 10th, and she was so excited that she had her tomato plants. She wanted to plant them early. And I said, Peg, it's a little bit early to be planting. She said, oh, I want my tomatoes early. I'm like, it doesn't work that way. I waited 10 more days, and I went out and I dug my holes, and I felt the soil, it felt really cold. I'm like, I'm not planting tomatoes this early. I'm going to wait. I waited 4 more days till the 24th of May, and I left the holes open so the warm days would warm that soil a little deeper.
Oh, yeah.
I actually backfilled the holes halfway, and I laid my plants on the side. And that is a thing too, like at that time of year when the deeper soil is cooler, if you can somehow get your plant closer to the surface of the soil is going to be warmer, and your plant will do better that way too. But I am with all of my warm weather stuff, it's tomatoes, pepper, eggplant, and melons. I always put the heat producing plastic down to its solar mulch or IRT mulch to warm up the soil a little bit more. And I like to have that on, if not a week, 2 weeks before I'm going to plant, so I know that soil is. And sometimes, if it is Memorial Day and it's a nice day, I usually cut a little X through it and tuck that back before I plant my plant in there. And sometimes we have very warm, sunny days when I'm planting, and that soil, it just feels warm and steamy. The air that's coming off of that soil, But anyway, back to her story. So I waited 14 days after her to plant my tomato plants, and if we flash forward, my tomatoes were ready 2 weeks before her. So even though she planted 2 weeks early, my tomatoes were actually 2 weeks earlier than hers. So planting early does not necessarily mean you're going to get early fruit.
Yeah. Now about the melons, I don't think we can grow them where we are in the Mayville area.
It would be tough. It would be tougher.
Yeah.
I think you could do it. I know, like where I worked in the Connecticut River Valley in Vermont, we had great melons there. But it's funny because the same zone that we are by Lake Erie here, which I think is like roughly USDA zone 5.5. If you follow that along and you look in Vermont, that same color on the map will go up the Connecticut River Valley. So we actually in the Lake Erie Basin area, like in the Dunkirk-Fredonia area, and probably Westfield, we have the exact same climate zone as the Connecticut River Valley in Vermont. And so there, we've got one farm that I first worked at. I mean, he had, beautiful big watermelons, cantaloupes, stuff like that. But up in the mountains where Elliott was, well, much different climate. I mean, it's similar to, the difference between the lake and where you live up on the hill. But there, Elliott was farming at like 3,000 feet elevation, and he was growing melons, like cantaloupes and stuff in the greenhouse, and we were all kind of laughing that they're like oohing and ahhing over these cantaloupes that are this big, and the ones that we're growing down in the valley are like 4 times the size, and we're growing them outside. We weren't even growing them in a greenhouse. But he even told us, he says sometimes in Vermont it's near impossible to grow a tomato from a plant to ripeness. He said because up where he was, up in the mountains. Not really mountains, but in the bigger hills, you're looking at sometimes, he said one year he planted his tomatoes on June 21st, on the first day of summer, so about 3 weeks later than we would, and he said June 25th they got 8 inches of snow up at his place, and it's not uncommon for them to get a killing freeze by the end of August, so they barely get a 2-week season. So he actually would do this thing where he would plant his row of tomatoes underneath a wooden trellis, but then he would, just to create a little bit of a microclimate, he would staple a clear piece of plastic onto the top bar where he trellised the tomatoes up, so there would be like a little baffle there. So if there was any wind that would hit the baffles, and he had rows of those things that would create this little microclimate, so it would warm up a little bit. But sometimes you have to do a lot more work in a climate like that too.
Right.
And really, like he did have some outdoor tomatoes, but he mostly grew indoor in his, and even he actually was very clever. He had 3 greenhouses with a space in between each greenhouse that was as wide as the greenhouses. So, and that creates a little microclimate between each greenhouse because you don't have the breeze and stuff. But in the early season, he would take PVC pipe and make hoops between the greenhouses, and he would grow in between there, and he would just put the row cover over the top of those hoops to give you, again, a little bit more protection. And I do like to do that. It was sort of by accident with eggplant that I discovered that if you it was really, really hot on Memorial Day, so I planted my tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, and it was just so cool and windy for the next few days that I put up hoops and I put it over my my eggplant, and I waited until June 21st to uncover them, and they were so beautiful. You know how like eggplant get a lot of the flea beetles get all over them? You'll have all these little tiny holes in them. Well, the row cover keeps them off. It's a physical barrier. If you bury the edges of this, or I even just sandbag this stuff in. So I'll have this. Usually I'll have a PVC hoops set up all the way down the bed, and then this where the green writing is on here. That's the top. That would be like the ridge where the top of this goes, and then you drape it down to either side. And I just buy like boxes of these. They're just like nylon drawstring bags, and I have to admit, last year we just went down to the beach in Dunkirk, and actually it was on Memorial Day weekend. I was like, well, there's nobody here, and we had buckets and we had sandbags, and we just like filled a bunch of those up. But if you have like even like one sandbag per hoop or every other hoop, bugs aren't going to get up underneath. So that's one of your primary physical barriers to keep the bugs away from your plants. And one of my main pests that I have a problem with where I grow is cucumber beetles. I don't know if you have a problem with those, but this stuff will keep them off. I mean, if you plant your seeds and just keep them covered, and usually what I do is I wait until I see the first female flowers forming, and I know then that they need to be pollinated, and then I'll uncover them. But then you usually have a decent size, sturdy plant that, because the bugs themselves, they do a little bit of damage, but they excrete the bacteria that forms bacterial wilt. And a lot of times your plant's like, well, I see there's a few bugs there, they're doing okay. And then right about the time they start to fruit, they just wilt and die off, and you get nothing off of those. But I do actually, I have in the past, I have used some organic pesticides, some sprays, and there's one, it's Sabadillo, which the trade name is red devil dust, and that really does actually kill bugs. It's actually a poisonous lily seed, actually, that's just like ground up, powdered, and you just like dust the plants. You can mix it with water and spray it on. Have not used that stuff in many, many years, but then you've probably heard of rotenone, but it's a poisonous chrysanthemum plant, and they call it the cube root plant, and they use the rhizome roots for that, powdered, ground up, and then you can use that. That actually is more of a repellent. It does not kill bugs, but a lot of times if you put it on, it makes the bugs kind of feel sick to their stomach, and they'll then avoid your stuff a little bit more. So I actually used to blend, the two of those and use that on my cucumbers, squash, melons, and stuff like that the cucumber beetles would get to. But the row cover works fantastic. You got to have it on them, as soon as the plants come up. And then, how you have to weed and hoe and stuff like that too. Usually I'll uncover one side, or I'd take the weights off one side, uncover, go in there, hoe really carefully, hand weed really carefully. Typically what I would do if I'm growing a big field of squash or something like that is I make sure that there's enough room in the row, and then certainly enough room between the rows that I can go through with my rototiller. So in the early stages when the plants are maybe this big, you still have to get in there and hand weed or hoe right underneath the plant, but at least that way you can kind of clean up very easily and quickly. And then then once the plants start to fill in, then you can, and again, like I said, once you see the first female flowers, and that's usually what I do. Well, and for the melon too, I mean, you could try this. Start your melon plant in like a peat pot or something, because they don't do well if you disrupt their roots. So if you planted them in a peat pot, like maybe a month before your warm up, and then use that IRT mulch, the infrared transfer mulch, so it heats up the soil. Get that stuff down, and then cut your X, plant your plant, put up a hoop, and then I actually use what's called a slitted row cover. It's not like this stuff. It's actually clear plastic that has slits in it, but I will often put the row cover over that because the cucumber beetles can get through the slits.
Oh yeah.
But once they get established, you look for either the plant to completely fill the entire area underneath there, and if they're being impeded by the plastic, you got to let them spread out. Or once you see the first female flowers, you know that the bees need to get to them and pollinate them. But using those couple of things, the heat-producing plastic and then the tunnel over them, you're kind of creating a greenhouse effect for them, because they really do like heat. I mean, they do better in warmer weather, warmer climates and stuff like that.
Yeah, somebody once told me when I was complaining about the cucumber beetles, they said something, I think it was marigolds, they said to plant between the I
usually plant whole flats of marigolds around my place. But yeah, that would possibly help, I think, also. But, again, too, like your cabbage loopers, I'll put, and the one thing that is a little bit bad about these is they do tend to keep the moisture in. So air, light, and water will pass through these. So when you have that up over your plant, it's not like putting a clear piece of plastic over it where it's not going to, like the rain isn't going to go through it. The rainwater will pass through. These gases pass through, so air will pass through it. But I've always known that they did warm up just a little bit, but I never really experienced it until last year. I had a girl helping me, and I had made two beds a little bit too close together, and I had the hoops up, but instead of having enough space to go between them and put sandbag here, the hoops were almost touching each other. So we were using these 10-foot 1 3/8 galvanized steel pipe to hold it down. So I was actually inside the tunnel pulling this piece of row cover this way, the other one the other way, and then laying the pipe on top. And so I was inside of the tunnel, and I was in there for not a long time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and I kind of became accustomed to the temperature that was inside. And when I went to come out of there, I was like, wow, it was probably 15 degrees warmer inside that tunnel than it was out. So they really do make a difference. And if, like radishes and stuff like that, sometimes I've grown those under those row covers, and the condition that it creates underneath there, I mean, you've got this tent that's warming up just a little bit more. It's more humid inside of there, and the leaves they'll just be like flawless because there's no bugs in there. You're growing them inside a little tent essentially. And I know we spoke earlier too that, I mean, I know this will probably air next month, but this is a really great time to order your seeds too for the season, because I know I do order a lot of my stuff comes from Johnny Selected Seeds and Fedco Seeds, and I want to say it's fedcoseeds.com is how to get a hold of them, but sometimes Fedco is a cooperative, very inexpensive seeds, but sometimes they will run out too. So if there's a big run on a popular type, so always good to order early. And I know I was telling you earlier that they used to do like an early bird thing. So if you got your order in by the end of January, you got a certain percentage off. And so I've always been used to ordering my seeds by the end of January. But I also did bring one more toy.
I was going to ask you, because we're down to just about 15 minutes here. So,
but yeah, this is a flame weeder, and there's different styles of these. I have I have this just hooked up to the regular propane tank that you would have on your gas grill, but this has you have the shut off there, but there's a shut off here. This actually you can adjust to how much flame. I mean, this will shoot like a 2.5 foot long flame as big around as that.
Oh wow!
So, but a lot of people I know we were saying before, and then it's got the little switch here, the handle. But a couple of things that I use this for is, I mean, so like I have my asparagus. We were talking about asparagus last time I was here 2 weeks ago, and the asparagus and all the weeds that were there are all dead and dry right now, and so I'll go over this and burn all that stuff up, and then if there's any little weeds coming, it'll take care of those. Now with another way that you can use this is we were saying earlier too, is like if you plant something like carrots. I mean, it could really be anything, but I know in Europe, the big organic growers there, I was telling you, they'll plant like 50-hectare field of carrots. And carrots are very slow to germinate. Plus, they're not really great competitors. When they first come up, they're like these tiny little wimpy little things with tiny little leaves on them. And if they take 2 or 3 weeks to germinate, a lot of your weed seeds will germinate in just like 2 or 3 days. So there'll be a whole field of weeds before the carrots even get established. So what they do is they take a pane of glass and they put it on just one little part of the field, and they'll monitor that. And when they see the first carrots germinating underneath the glass, they know they have 2 or 3 days till the carrots germinate, so they'll wait maybe till the next day, and they'll go through and flame the whole field. And I know, again, I think a lot of people get the wrong idea about these. They call them weed burners, but it's really a flame weeder, so you really don't have to sit there and incinerate the weed with the flame. All you need to do is go over it and essentially cook it, so you've cooked the cell layer, so the cell walls will break down, and then when the sun hits those, then they're just gone, they're just done. If you really, really, really like, sometimes I'll use this around my driveway. I have a gravel driveway, and I'll wait for there to be like a dry few days, and I'll go and flame it one day, and then even the perennial weeds that have strong roots, they'll wilt and they'll be all dried up and brown in the sun, and a couple days later I'll just go by again and just touch them just a little bit with a little bit more flame, and it'll burn them right up, so then there is no weed there whatsoever. But yeah, it works great though in the garden setting. Even just this small thing like that. I mean, I have beds that are like 25, 40-foot long beds, 30 inches wide, and I'll do that. I'll plant carrots or even beets or any kind of field crop that I'm planting from seed, and just before the crop germinates, I'll go through and flame that, and then it saves you a bit of work in hand weeding and hoeing and stuff like that. Because like I said, if the crop that you're planting comes up in a completely clean field, because even beets, in the springtime can take a couple of weeks to germinate. So again, a lot of time your weed seeds germinate a little bit quicker. So good to it's obviously better to if you can go through it in a clean field. Because sometimes too with the hoeing, even though I use that collinear hoe, I plant in a 30-inch wide bed, I plant 6 rows of lettuce. So they're not that far apart. So if the lettuce seedlings are little tiny things like this, and I've dug a little trench with that seeder that I use, or it makes a little furrow, that's actually lower. So if I try to knock down that little ridge in between where the weeds would be growing, sometimes I bury the lettuce seedlings. So if you can do something with the flame, if you do something with a little bit of heat before they come up, then you have a cleaner bed, and you don't have to disrupt the soil. You don't have to bury your plants. You don't have to get down there and hand weed as readily. And I know I was telling you
is this something you would just use early in the spring?
Oh, it just depends on when you plant it. I mean, a lot of times, like for me, I plant my main carrot crop like for a fall crop. So when my garlic is done, when my garlic plants come out, when I dig my garlic in like mid-July, usually within a few days, I rototill it, I bring in fresh compost, and then I'll plant my carrots towards the end of July. That way in October I'll have a really nice crop. So it's really more so at the early part of planting, but it could be spring, or it just could be really any time of the season. But I know I started to tell you, my friend Craig has an organic grape farm out in Sheridan, and he has a piece of equipment. He gets the bigger tanks than these, and he has a unit on the back of his tractor, and it has the jets like that. I think there's 6 jets on each side, so he can actually drive through between his grape rows, and the flames actually burn the weeds on either side, so he doesn't have to use herbicide on his organic grape fields. And you think like, well, but wouldn't it affect the grapes? But the stalk of the grape is hard and woody down there, and granted, you're putting a fair amount of heat to it, but it's just like it's just going past. It's not like you're sitting there and putting the flame to the trunk of the grapevine. It's just you're and the thing is too, with the perennial weeds, you would have to keep doing it over and over. Like let's say a dandelion, you went over and flamed it one day, and then a couple days later you went back and you burned everything off it and got rid of it. Well, that root that's underground is going to keep producing. But if it starts to come back up, and 2 weeks later it's starting to grow again, and you flame it again, it's going to die back, and then a couple weeks later it's going to come. But you can eventually weaken it enough that you can actually kill it off. But it's primarily for like the baby weeds, the new things that are just coming, the things that don't have like super strong perennial roots on them yet. But so if you just had a little dandelion that had just germinated, you could probably flame that once and it would be done. But how sometimes when you plant stuff in the springtime, it just comes up like a carpet of little baby weeds. That's what it would be ideal for. But also, like I said, like for cleanup, sometimes too, like a bed that got weedy at the end of the last season. And actually, that's the nice thing about it too, I mentioned earlier, is that if you have some old weeds in there, their seeds are there, and this thing, it will potentially burn up some of the actual weeds, so or the weed seeds, so you don't have as many seeds. Exactly.
What is that thing that will come up and grow all over the garden that looks like it's trying to take over? It just seems to grow all over the place. It's kind of a reddish.
With the succulent kind of leaves to it,
yeah.
like they sort of like, it almost looks like a little jade plant almost. the leaves?
Yeah.
Purslane. You have that?
Yeah.
You should be eating that.
Really?
That's
Really?
just one of the most highly nutritious wild plants there is, yeah. And it has a little bit of a tartness to it. It's a little bit sour. I actually grow I actually do grow a cultivated variety of that. But yeah, I mean, I have restaurants that pay me $20 and $25 a pound for that stuff.
Because I remember one time when my husband had to be away from home for several weeks. That I remember I was out in the garden and I noticed this stuff and it looked like it was threatening to choke all
it will
the vegetable
spread
plants, and it was like I just had to keep pulling it out all the time,
yeah,
you know, because
and the thing about it too, it really is like once it's established. I know when I was at that summer of '88 in Ohio, I pulled up a big clump of it, and you know it was probably like this, and I went to throw it out of the garden, and it caught on the fence, and it hung on that fence through those 100 and some degree days for like over a month, and you would think it would have been like crisp and dry. After we got that big rain at the end of July, it started to regrow on the fence. Just the amount of dirt that was clinging to the roots, and it's hanging, you know, on a 4-foot high fence, and it actually did start to regrow. So, but
it seems like something that would take over if you let it.
Right,
you know?
right. But that's also one of the reasons why it's actually so highly nutritious. It's a tough plant. But yeah, I will actually I like it myself. I know. One friend of mine came by one summer a number of years ago, and I was showing him some other different wild edible plants. And when I saw him at a class a couple weeks later, he says, "Hey," he says, "Was it Food and Wine magazine?" He said they picked the most popular. You know what the most popular wild green is this year? I'm like lamb's quarters. I don't know. He said, "No," he says, "purslane." He says, "Look it up. Look it up." Well, I forgot which publication he said it was, so I just Googled purslane salad, and there was a woman who said that her grandmother would always ask her, "Is there any purslane out in the garden?" And she was a fairly famous chef, so she made up a recipe for a purslane salad, and I was like, boy, that sounds really good. So I actually had a salad for breakfast the next morning. I went out, walked my dogs, took a bag with me, picked fresh purslane, but it was just, and the purslane has a little bit of natural tartness to it by itself, so you don't have to add an acid. You don't have to add like vinegar or lemon juice to your dressing. They say just salt and a little bit of olive oil, but I had the purslane tips washed, spun out, dried, and then that with like some heirloom tomato, a little bit of red onion, and a hard-boiled egg. With my purslane salad, and like I said, it's the wild is a little bit more tart than the cultivated strain that I use, and it's called golden purslane. And you can get it at Johnny's Selected Seed. And those, like the ones that you're talking about, I mean, the leaves are usually like what, maybe a 1/4 inch by maybe an inch. The golden purslane, the leaves are almost probably an inch or more wide, so they are more like a jade leaf, but it's more like the one that you find in the wild here in our gardens. Oftentimes, is like a normal green color, like any other weed, pretty much. But the one that I buy from Johnny's is it's called golden, and it is a lighter, yellower kind of green.
Yeah. This is reddish tinged, you know.
The stems are red, is what you're talking about, right?
Oh man. I'd have to actually. I'd actually have to
we'll
have.
Talk
some,
about it in August.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but if it is the one I'm talking about, it's got a like a red stem, and then those kind of elliptical, almost teardrop shaped leaves come off. It's very similar. It's actually in the same family as portulaca. Have you ever grown the portulaca flowers? It's in actually the same family.
Well, you know, it looks like, I'm surprised, you know, considering the fact that you get it growing in the garden. I'm surprised that it doesn't take over the lawn and squeeze out the grass, but it doesn't.
It's, you know, I have the book it's Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, Weeds and What They Tell, and I want to say he says that a lot of these weeds will follow human activity, so a lot of times they won't grow necessarily in a natural field or in grass, but when you till the ground up, they'll grow
That's
like
when they.
in
That's
tilled-
where they like to grow.
Exactly,
Is
they'll
where
grow-
you've been tilling
yeah,
the
in
ground.
tilled soil more so than in the grass. But oftentimes too, I mean, even at my office on Main Street in Fredonia, a lot of times that's why I tell people are like, oh, I'm not sure if I noticed. It's like it grows in the cracks in the sidewalks or like up against the building where there's a seam or something like that. It doesn't need much to grow, but even sometimes, I mean, I've seen there's just like a crack in the sidewalk and this stuff is just like branching
Spreading
out.
out over onto the top
Yeah.
of the sidewalk.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't need much not much area to grow, and doesn't need super great soil to grow, but it is good. It's very. I like it. I mean, you can imagine. Well, and even in fact, my friend Rich used to have the Catch 18 restaurant down at the boardwalk in Dunkirk, and I went down there one time and it was super busy, and he said, "Hey, I'm doing a special." He had a sockeye salmon with, he said, all the stuff that I got from you, and he used that, and people were saying, where do you get that stuff? And he's of course got to make it seem like it's like, well, you got to know people, like how to, before you can get, because, and really, I mean, I honestly have never seen purslane for sale anywhere. I mean, I think obviously other people must grow it in other parts of the country, but I've never been into a grocery store where I've seen purslane for sale, and never really seen it anywhere for sale. But like I said, I've grown it for years. I've picked the wild stuff for years. In fact, it will naturalize in your garden. The wild or that cultivated strain, the golden purslane. If you let it go to seed, it will come back up in your garden for some years. I actually try to grow it in the same place every year, but I also grow some in a tray, and then I'll go out there to plant, and I'll be like, well, there's one already coming up there, and I'll just try to like intersperse. But it just grows like a mat in an area. But the stalks are a lot thicker too, like that. The wild stuff, if it is the stuff you're talking about, the stalks are maybe, I don't know, what's that, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, but the cultivated ones are definitely about twice as thick, but not tough or woody or anything either. They're very succulent. I mean, like I said, it really does look like a jade leaf, jade plant. The cultivated one more so. I mean, the wild one, similar to a jade leaf, but would be tiny compared to the wild. All right, yes, to the cultivated. I mean, sorry.
Okay, well, it's that time again.
Are we done?
We've got 19 seconds.
Okay.
17, 16,
Well, I do like your tie-dye.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Oh, yeah, thank you for coming on again, and we'll probably have you on again in the fall.
Sure. Sounds
Okay.
good. Maybe some fall harvest stuff, huh?
Yeah, that'd be fun. And I'll see the rest of you in the viewing audience on the next episode in a couple of weeks.